Government, the place you pay your taxes to. Obviously, the government does more than just tax you, and today we will be looking at how the governments around the world do those things. The world can be divided into 10 categories of governments, which we'll be exploring in this video. This is everything you need to know about governments. Before we get to the actual video, do keep in mind that this video is about political sciences, and in any social science there are no black and white, true or false answers. So everything I say is generally true, but can vary from case to case. Especially in political sciences, there are asterisks attached to everything, so do keep that in mind, that things can be interpreted in different ways. I would be happy to hear your corrections and feedback in the comment section below, if you do have any. Alright, so let's start with the basics. I'll be talking a lot in this video about the different powers in government, so I will clarify what these powers are and what they do in this short introduction. All countries in the world have a legislative, executive, and judicial power. Now you can start off by forgetting about the judicial power because it's usually separate from the government, so we won't be talking about it in this video. The legislative power, however, is the law-making sector of the government. Here, new laws are discussed and either approved or rejected. In most democratic systems, the legislative body is made up of a large number of people with different ideologies and beliefs elected by the populace of the country. Now the executive power, on the other hand, takes the laws that the legislative power approved and puts them into action. Usually the executive power is a smaller group of individuals that are either directly elected or chosen from the legislative. So for example, if the legislative power passed a law stating that all people needed to wear hats on Tuesdays, or they would get fined, the executive power would hire inspectors to make sure people are wearing hats, build signs to let people know of the new laws, and build the facilities to punish people for breaking said new law. These two powers are important to know since we will be looking at how they are different in each government. Now let's finally get to the meat of this video by looking at this great map I found on Wikipedia. As a side note, I love maps. I could look at data maps for literally hours, but maybe I'm just a nerd when it comes to that kind of stuff. Anyways, let's get to what these colors mean. The blue countries on the map are presidential republics. The yellow are semi-presidential republics. The orange are parliamentary republics. The green are, and get ready for this because it's a mouthful, parliamentary republics with an executive presidency elected by and dependent on a parliament. Yeah, that one just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? The red countries are parliamentary constitutional monarchies in which the monarch does not personally exercise power. The pink countries are constitutional monarchies in which the monarch personally exercises power, often alongside a weak parliament. The purple ones are absolute monarchies. The brown ones are states whose constitution grant only a single party the right to govern. And finally, the green ones are states where constitutional provisions of government have been suspended. Now you can probably see how these terms can be confusing, especially the longer ones. And that is why I'm going to make this video to try to clarify what all of these mean, and try to differentiate the differences between the similar ones. The most common form of government in the world is the presidential republic. It is the first governmental form we're going to be looking at in this video, and it is also represented in blue on the map. Notable countries with a presidential republic are the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Iran, and the only European country, Belarus. In a presidential republic, the population of the country or state elects a president who is the head of state as well as the head of government. This is done through direct elections between several candidates from different parties. Usually the president has a fixed term limit in office to let other presidents take his place. The president only has executive power and usually has no impact on the legislative decisions of a country. Now, as I did mention in my past video, not all presidents are leaders of presidential republics. Countries such as China use the title of president to designate their head of state, although there are no elections and only one party. Now, to return to the previous points of legislative and executive power split. In a presidential republic, the president and his cabinet, which make up the executive power, have no impact on the legislative power, which is also a group of elected officials. This is done to assure that power stays in check. If the legislative power makes a decision that the executive does not agree with, the executive power can then vote in non-confidence. This system gives presidential republics their reputation of being very stable. Now, presidential republics do have some shortcomings. Presidential governments explicitly separate executive and legislative sectors, which can cause long periods of stagnation, with conflicting parties taking power in both. Different election cycles in both powers can cause years of political gridlock, where the legislative would propose a bill and would immediately be rejected by the executive power. Another problem with presidential republics is that a president is very hard to remove from office if he is tyrannical. Once a president is elected, he is almost always guaranteed to serve his entire term until another election. There are some situations where a president did not serve their entire term, but that was either because of fraud, death, or demission. There is an impeachment process in many presidential republics, but it is a long process which relies on the executive and legislative vote, which can be greatly influenced by the president himself. Both of these problems are not present in a parliamentary republic, which we will see very shortly. But first, let's look at another type of presidential republic. So now that we know that the presidential republics are democracies that elect a president as their head of state and head of government who is completely separate from the legislative power, let's take a look at the next government form in the list, the very similar semi-presidential republic, in yellow. Some notable countries that use this form of government are Russia, France, Ukraine, Egypt, and Taiwan. Instead of restating all the same aspects we just saw with the presidential republic, let's look at what is new and different with this system. In the semi-presidential system, there is the president who is directly elected by the population, and also a prime minister who is either chosen by the president or by the parliament. These two governing bodies work in unison to govern the country. Semi-presidential systems thus have two executive powers, the president and the prime minister with his cabinet. The president and prime minister come from opposing parties, which is called cohabitation. This is a double-edged sword because it can cause periods of political stagnation, but it also creates a natural system of checks and balances for both leaders. If one of the two powers becomes too zealous with their policies, the other leader can veto their decision. This creates a political standstill, which is why many countries have policies to avoid this. In France, for example, it is courtesy to divide the power. The president takes care of foreign policy and defense, while the prime minister overlooks the economy and domestic policies. A semi-presidential republic takes aspects from parliamentary and presidential republics to create a balanced and fair government. Now that we have covered both types of presidential republics, let's move on to the parliamentary republics, which are colored in orange on the map. Some notable examples of countries that use the parliamentary system of government are Germany, Italy, Finland, Turkey, and India. The most important distinction of the parliamentary republic is the intertwinement of the executive and legislative power, which was not there in the presidential system. The prime minister, who is the head of the government and the head of the executive power, along with his cabinet, are all elected representatives in the legislative body. To make this a bit clear, I will take Finland as an example. Why Finland, you may ask? Because Finland is a nice little Scandinavian country with a fairly basic parliamentary system. Unlike Germany, which was going to be my example, but they have millions of asterisks attached to their parliamentary system. Anyhow, Finland's Prime Minister, Juha Sipilä, is also the leader of Finland's Centre Party. For someone to be Prime Minister in a parliamentary republic, they need to have the confidence of the House, which is usually accorded to the party with the most seats in Parliament. I say mostly because it can happen that a coalition government can form where two parties have less seats than the winning party, but take control because together they form a majority. This is actually the case in Finland currently between the right and left coalitions. Anyways, the Prime Minister along with his cabinet have to win their seats in Parliament, like all the other ministers, which ensures their legitimacy. Each seat in Parliament represents a region of the country. During a federal election, each of these electoral regions elects a member of Parliament. In Finland, for example, there are 15 electoral districts with 200 seats between all of them. Usually a seat is representative of a certain amount of people, as to keep the power of all members of Parliament fairly equal. There are exceptions to this rule in cases such as the semi-autonomous Åland Islands in Finland, which get a seat in Parliament even though they don't meet the population requirement to have one. Now on to how a parliamentary republic works. Strangely, a parliamentary system calls for a prime minister and a president. Unlike semi-presidential republics, the president holds no real executive power. The president is more of a figurehead, being the official head of state, comparatively to the prime minister, who is the head of government, the leader of the executive power, and a member of the legislative power. Presidents are elected in nationwide elections, similarly to the presidential system, of course. The legislative power is elected by the populace, but people may only vote for a representative in their region. Thus, each member of parliament represents one region, as mentioned before. That is really the basics of the parliamentary system. There are so many intricacies in the system that I could make an hour-long video just talking about this government type, but alas, we must move on. Next one on the list is a mouthful, so get ready for this. The parliamentary republic with an executive presidency elected by and dependent on parliament, which is in green on the map. Now, since that's a mouthful, we will call it a parliamentary presidential republic for this video, because using the other term would be kind of illogical. Anyways, now since there are so few countries in the world that use this variation of republic, I will name them all. These countries are Suriname, Botswana, South Africa, and San Marino. This method of government is very similar to the parliamentary republic, except that they have no prime minister. Instead, the executive power is composed of a president and his cabinet. The president's cabinet is made up of a vice president and ministers who are all appointed by the president from the parliament. Speaking of parliament, the presidential parliamentary republic does have a parliament that takes care of legislative duties. The members of parliament are elected by the people and all represent different parts of the country. The only main difference between this system and a parliamentary republic is that the president is both the head of state and the head of government. This is a very rare form of government and honestly doesn't need any more explanation. Let's continue. For the next government type on the list, we'll be looking at a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, in which the monarch does not personally exercise any power, or as I will refer to them for this video, parliamentary constitutional monarchies. They are in a red color on the map, and some notable countries with this form of government are Canada, the United Kingdom, Spain, Sweden, and Austria. I'm actually very familiar with this form of government because I live in a parliamentary constitutional monarchy here in Canada. There really is only one difference between this form of government and the normal parliamentary republic. That difference is that the head of state is a monarch. Now, as I specified before, in a parliamentary system, the head of state has no real executive power, which if you didn't quite understand how this was possible before, you will see why now. In Canada's case, for example, our head of state is Queen Elizabeth II. Thus, any law passed in the Canadian Parliament has to be approved by the Queen before it is official. Now, this might seem shocking that to this day Canada is still constrained by some old royals' opinion on laws, but Queen Elizabeth has never rejected a single law in her entire reign as Queen. It is understood that the power is symbolic and that it can be stripped away at any time. So although a monarch is the head of state, like a president is the head of state in a parliamentary republic, the monarch has no real power other than being really rich and living the good life. All the political systems we have seen so far have been democratic, so I think it is time to look at some governments that don't believe in letting the masses decide who should be in charge. The first category of non-democratic governments we will be looking at is, as Wikipedia states it, a constitutional monarchy in which the monarch personally exercises power, but often, but not always, alongside a weak parliament. This is a long title, so I will just call this a constitutional monarchy. The countries that have constitutional monarchies are Morocco, Swaziland, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Jordan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Bhutan, and Tonga. The best way to explain this form of government is a monarchy with restrictions, those restrictions being the Constitution. There are many variations of constitutional monarchies, varying from Monaco and Liechtenstein that are considered almost democratic, to Kuwait and Bahrain that are on the verge of being absolute monarchies, which we will be seeing shortly. The distinction needed for a country to be considered a constitutional monarchy instead of a parliamentary constitutional monarchy is that the monarch has to have executive power alongside an elected parliament or government to advise said monarch. In Monaco, for instance, the prince is the executive power along with a council that he appoints, but the legislative and judicial powers are filled with elected officials. In Kuwait, the executive power is the prime minister, who is once again appointed by the emir, who is the monarch of Kuwait. Now, the interesting thing is that the prime minister in Kuwait does not have to win his seat. He can be anyone that the emir wants to appoint. But there is a regulation that at least one of the prime minister's cabinet has to be an elected official. But as to how transparent those elections are is to be debated. All in all, constitutional monarchies are a way of having a monarch with power, but also giving some legitimacy to the government. I think that's all there is to say for that. Now we are looking at the most ancient and simple form of government, the absolute monarchy. There are not many countries that still have absolute monarchies, but the ones that do are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Brunei, and the Vatican. Absolute monarchies are the most simple form of government because of how straightforward they are in their power disposition. The way it works is the monarch is given absolute power. In an absolute monarchy, the king or queen has the power to do anything and no one can oppose them. The power is transferred hereditarily except in the Vatican's case where it is an elected monarchy, where the cardinals vote for the next pope. I can make another video completely about the Vatican because of how interesting of a country it is, but we'll leave that to another time. Now, in theory, the monarch does have absolute power, but the ruler only has as much power as his or her people will let them have. The people are meant to keep this power in check by revolting if the monarch does something tyrannical. This is an ineffective form of government because of its reliance on revolt for change. Thus, tyranny is a problem in these countries, especially in the Middle Eastern monarchies that have strict laws against women and other religions, which are often criticized for being unjust. An absolute monarchy is a dictatorship transmitted hereditarily. It is the simplest but most illegitimate form of government. We are coming to the end here, so hang on. The before last category is single-party states, which are in brown on the map. Examples of countries that practice this form of government are China, North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Western Sahara, and Cuba. You might already see what all these countries have in common. They are non-democratic. These countries are called single-party states for a reason. They only have one political party. All other political opinions are either outlawed or given a lower status. All of these states are communist except for North Korea, which is a dictatorship. None of these countries hold elections because there is no one to vote for except whoever is already in power. These countries try to incite strong nationalist sentiments amongst their people so they believe the only good government is the one in power. By creating this false image of singularity and by extinguishing all individuality, these countries justify only having one party. Like absolute monarchies, these states can do what they wish because there is no opposition. This leads to many human rights violations coming from these countries, but it's not all bad. Cuba, for instance, has a great healthcare and is ranked the 12th happiest country in the world. They achieve this by offering free healthcare and education to all their citizens in return for their service to the state. Overall, though, single-party states are censored, propaganda-filled, and authoritarian. These regimes often come under fire from democratic countries because of their unfair political practices and violations of human rights. Finally, it is time to explore the last category on the list. This category only has one country in it, and it is Thailand, which is a state where constitutional provisions for government have been suspended. Now, this is basically the category for a non-constitutional government, so no government. Thailand is usually a constitutional monarchy, but it has been ruled under a military dictatorship since 2014. Since the current governing party is not constitutionally allowed to rule, Thailand is in a sort of gray area until the dictator and his army are able to form a true government. The next few years we will probably see Thailand become a single-party state, but until then, they are in the political limbo. And on that note, it is safe to say that we covered every government in the world, except for one. If you are very observant, you might have noticed one country that has not been in any of these categories, and that country is Switzerland. Switzerland is such a unique country that I thought it would be interesting to talk about Switzerland for my next video. I will talk about their unique government form, neutral history, and other things that fascinate me about this unique gem. So make sure to subscribe to be notified then when this video will come out. Oh, and if you want to get constant updates from me for any reason, please do check out my Twitter and Facebook. The links will also be in the description. Finally, YouTube has a policy, which kind of surprised me as well. I'm sure it'll be surprising you guys as well, where if your video is too controversial and sensitive, they will not allow you to monetize this. This is the case for my videos since they tend to focus on fairly political controversial topics, especially my last video about the Syrian refugee crisis, which I will plug right here. If you do wish to watch it, there's an annotation on the screen right now to go watch it. It's a great video. So in that case, I set up a Patreon account where you can support me further. The link to my Patreon is also in the description. I set up a few perks which I think you guys will enjoy. Anyways, I have rambled for long enough. Thanks for watching, and this has been everything you need to know about government.